Okay, I'll call the meeting of the City of Kerrville Planning and Zoning Commission to order at 4:31. Dorothy, will you call roll?
Yes, sir. Bob Waller,
Present.
Garrett Harmon,
Here.
Tricia Byram,
Here.
Rustin Zuber,
Here.
David Jones,
Here.
Bill Morgan.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. We do have a quorum. I'd like to recognize Tracy Byram. This is her, Tricia Byram, excuse me, as our newest member of the Planning and Zoning Commission. Welcome. Okay, number one on the agenda, visitor citizens forum. Any person with business not scheduled on the agenda is encouraged to briefly speak to the commission. Please fill out the speaker request form. I've already got several. Give it to the commission secretary prior to the meeting. Number of speakers limited to the first 10. Each speaker limited to 3 minutes. No formal action can be taken on these items, as the Open Meetings Act requires formal action items to be posted on an agenda no later than 72 hours before the meeting. If formal action is required, the items will be placed on an agenda for a future meeting. Item number 2, the consent agenda. All items listed below in the consent agenda are considered routine or ministerial in nature and will be enacted with one motion. There will be no separate discussion of items unless the commissioner or citizen so requests, in which case the item or items will be removed from the consent agenda considered separately. Item number 3 is a public hearing, consideration and action, public hearing and action, annexation and zone. Drew?
Thank you, sir. Afternoon, Commission. This is 59 acres along Thompson Highway, or Thompson Drive, for annexation and zoning of W7. As recommended through the zoning district, W7 may be extended with annexations to the surrounding properties. It is intended to be tourist, visitor, and recreational uses and some limited commercial based on conditional use permits for some of those. Here's a survey of the existing property as it sits today. I will point out there has been one correction on this survey. There's a label right about here that labels this private driveway as Knapp Road as right-of-way. That has been confirmed that it is not dedicated right-of-way, it is a private drive, just for the record. Additionally, this area has been identified in the Kerrville 2050 Comprehensive Plan as an area to be expanded, one of the catalyst areas surrounding Thompson Drive and Nimitz Lake for future development. And with that, staff recommends the W7 zoning and recommendation of annexation. I'd be pleased to answer any questions now or after the public hearing.
Okay, do y'all have any questions at this time? If not, we'll open the public hearing at 4:35. Anyone wishing to make comments to this commission, step forward to the podium. State your name and address, please. I do have some speaker forms. Let me look at these. First of all, let me say this is an agenda item for the same track that's for a plat consideration. Let's keep the conversation separate if we can. Bonnie Johnson.
I will be first. Hello, my name is Bonnie Johnson. I have lived in Kerrville since 1963. I grew up and I am currently living on 2 acres that adjoins the Thompson Drive development property line. When we moved to Kerrville, the only road to our home was the Knapp Road low water crossing that's now the boat launch at Chili's. The river rose 7 times our first year. My mother was a school teacher and thought she just had to get to work, so we rode the Goss Johnston cement trucks across the raging river to get her to school. Yes, I have seen a lot of changes in the last 55 years, but it breaks my heart to watch my childhood playground and my favorite bird watching area, where I watched the blue herons, the white egrets, the osprey, the bluebirds, turn into a development with 11 commercial sites and 3 apartment complexes. As I stated in my letter that was read at the July 10th council meeting, I have no plans to attempt to stop this development. We hope to come to a reasonable compromise with them. As a matter of fact, on Tuesday, July 31st at approximately 2 p.m., our attorney met with Steve Schulte. In concession for us allowing them to close the county-maintained Knapp Road, they agreed not to use our private road. We were offered a privacy fence, a private entrance to our property from their new road, a limit of 2-story height on the apartment complex next to us, and an additional setback on that unit. We greatly appreciate the gesture of goodwill. However, there is still one deficiency in the current plat that greatly concerns me, which was just corrected. My concern was the 60-foot right-of-way on the west side of the project. There is no right-of-way there, and there never has been, and I have the proof for that. This is a private driveway. It has been maintained by the private property owners and has been under the control of the private property owners. So my main concern was that with this right-of-way being on the plat being considered, that it would open up my private property to a future development. I am very pleased to hear that that has been corrected, and so I just ask that the developer keeps in mind what's best for our community and to please regard the beautiful country that he is fixing to develop. Thank you.
Thank you. James Bilta.
I'm James Bilta, and I live at 1520 Knapp Road, which is at the end of the real Knapp Road, not the one they have labeled on the side as Knapp Road, which is our private driveway. On the plat, it shows Knapp Road to be abandoned. And I've talked with Drew, and by the way, I want to compliment him on his courtesies in giving us information we need. He's been very forthcoming with that, and it's been very helpful. But that the abandonment of that road, part of it's city road, part of it's county road. And that is my only legal access to my property. It's been there approximately 85 years. I live in the house that old Dr. Knapp had. It's a fairly historical house. It was built early part of this century, and we've upgraded it, and this is our only access. I'll address that when I speak about the plat, which you've requested we keep the comments separate from the annexation and the plat. I have a lot of comments about that. So I want to make it clear that the annexation does not affect that Knapp Road at all. Part of it's by the city, part of it's owned by the county. are controlled by the county. I don't know who owns it. I have a title company researching that right now to determine who actually owns that road and what the history of it is. But we're very much opposed to it being closed. We have no other legal access, and we don't think it's reasonable that we come down through their development and their construction for 5 years to get to our house. And so we oppose that completely. Most of my other comments have to do with the plat, but on the annexation, a portion of the land that's proposed to be annexed is on our side of a fence, which has been there since approximately 1984, or prior to 84. The Johnsons probably know about when it was constructed because they lived there at that time and I didn't. But there's a section of that that is on our side of that fence. And I'm not sure who owns that property after 60 years, 50 years of that fence being there and it being maintained by us. You need to know that both ends of this road have been enclosed by gates. It's a private road. The gate up on the highway on Thompson Drive has been there forever. The other gate has been there for approximately 6 years. I've had no communication with the proposed developers except a letter from their lawyer containing threats about the road, the fences, and the gates. So that's where we stand on that, and I'll address most of the issues I have about the plat at my time for that. Any questions?
Not at this time. Thank you, Mr. Belton. J.E. Johnson.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for letting me visit with you here today. First of all, I want to thank the McDonald Organization and Drew Paxton for attending to the issue of the 60-foot right-of-way. That was one of the points that I was going to discuss with you. The other two are the referring to the preliminary plat of the Thompson Drive subdivision, and that's in your packet. Basically, it was submitted to Kerr County Commissioners Court in an informal setting. I am requesting that it be regenerated in such a way as to delineate the pondage and retainage of water as a result of the stormwater runoff.
Let me interrupt you 1 second. Are you addressing the plat issue or the annexation?
It is part of the annexation. It is a combination, if you will, because both of those items are on your agenda.
Right. We were trying to separate the plat issue second.
Very well. Then, in that case, we'll move on down to the bottom of the accommodations and considerations going forward for the 100-year floodplain. Those items are, in my way of thinking, part of the annexation because they need to be addressed on that annexation document. So, number one, for the benefit of the developers, so they know what they're getting into as far as the requirement of pondage and retainage, but also so that the TCEQ and the FEMA folks are happy, because it would be unfortunate and incorrect for the contractors to get busy, the developer get busy, spend lots of money on lots of plans, and then all of a sudden realize that, hey, we've got pondage and retainage things that need to be addressed in that. On the two documents that I gave you in red on that one document, it indicates a possible way of going forward to where it does not cause a great deal of expense to the developers, so that they can use what is already there and be able to generate their annexation plat with the information that's there to how to deal with those waters. And by draining everything towards that swale in the middle of that project, they're able to get forward with their project, smooth off the dirt, get their pads built, and move forward and save a lot of money and a lot of heartbreak. Also, you might take a look at that. There is a blue curved line. And that blue curved line is a suggestion on how to address the issue of the Knapp Road, County Knapp Road disappearing, and still be able to develop the park that is below, and be able to address the pondage and retainage. And I think it will save a lot of money, and I feel certain that the McDonald Group is going to build an exemplary thing. It'll be the flagship of the 2050 plan. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you. Bill Matthews.
Chairman, I think most of my comments relate to the plat.
Okay,
So
Thank you.
I'll just defer.
the plat, I don't believe is a public hearing. Is that correct, Drew?
That's correct. The plat is not a public hearing.
Okay,
the
but we
commission-
will hear comments.
Yeah,
at
commission
that
can
time.
hear comments, correct.
Okay. Anybody else or any other comments during the public hearing portion? Hearing none, seeing none, I close public hearing at 4:48. Comments from the commission?
Drew, is drainage an annexation issue?
Not necessarily. City of Kerrville does have some regulation for drainage outside in the ETJ as well. So as the project develops is when we'd start addressing the stormwater drainage, making sure it follows the current ordinances.
Does this correction regarding the right-of-way versus a private drive, does that need to be corrected prior to?
The actual meets and bounds description is what will go with the annexation ordinance through council action. The illustration, we can talk to surveyor and engineer and see if we can get an updated illustration.
Mhm.
But the meets and bounds are actually the controlling document describing the boundary.
Right.
That does not identify that as right of way.
And regarding one of the comments that it's hard to tell on this drawing of what we have here, what is the distance, the difference between the existing fence line and the actual property line?
Roughly 10 to 12 feet.
Okay.
It varies north and south. But
Okay.
Also, you have Knapp Road along the river to be abandoned.
Right, as part of their design on the plat, they are proposing to abandon that road. That is not a decision rendered by the planning commission, it's actually a city council decision.
I was going to say, it doesn't come into play here.
Correct. As part of their, and we'll address it a little further in the plat comments, but as part of their proposed layout, they are showing that they're looking to request that closure and dedicating another road in its place of sorts.
Okay, so that it's clear to me, I guess, and to the members of this commission, the Knapp Road that goes from Thompson Drive towards the river, which is the private drive.
Correct.
Okay, has that issue been,
Well, sorry, there's two roads.
I'm talking about the private drive portion.
Right, the private drive from Thompson down towards the river, down at this location. is a private drive. It is private property. There's only one small portion of that that has a recorded easement on that.
Okay, so this property, we're considering will not infringe on that at all?
The property line does run down that private drive, roughly 10 or 12 feet. Again, it's kind of hard to see in this.
But has that issue been settled at this point?
Between the developer and the neighbors?
They are working on it. I don't know that it's been completely resolved.
Well, we agree it's a private drive. The problem is that we own half of it, and
Okay.
we offer to transfer that to the property owners.
Okay.
You've offered transfer, Steve?
Yes.
Okay.
Can I respond to that?
Yes, sir.
They say they offered to transfer that to us. They offered to transfer it to us if we would agree to everything they want to do on that 50 acres, including abandoning the roads, whatever the density is, no water control. Their proposition was they'd give us that 10 feet if we would give them everything they want to do out there. And I don't think there's anything reasonable about that.
Okay, so there is no agreement?
Absolutely not.
Okay. If we move forward recommending annexation, how does that address that situation?
The petition annexation is based on the ownership of the McDonald property. So it would run down that private drive for the portion that they own would be annexed.
Okay, so then it's up to the neighbors and
It'd be a civil
McDonald's
issue.
to work that out.
Correct.
If it is indeed a private drive, how does it fall within the half ownership of each tract?
The property line runs down the middle of it.
Property,
Right.
okay, so they own the property, McDonald's own the property, you purchased
They
the
own half
property,
of
and that is in your.
Correct.
Okay.
So it'd be a civil discussion between the two property, or the adjacent property owners, and how that's resolved. But the annexation is based on that ownership description.
Other questions?
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question? If the annexation takes in the 12 feet that is currently outside the boundaries of, the 12 questionable feet of the private road, if that's annexed and then at a later date they deed that to us, are we being deeded an annexed property?
Yes.
So you'll have some county and city
Taxes
property
associated with it.
possibly. I don't see how that works. Can you address that, Drew?
They would have the option to either go through city council for de-annexation of that portion, or on the appraisal district, it would just be treated as two separate pieces of property. One being city for that 10 or 12 feet, and the remainder of their property still being within the county.
So they could have some prorated tax
Right.
liability. And all we're being asked to do here is recommend zoning
That's correct.
as opposed to recommending annexation.
Right. Along with the annexation, your recommendation of the W7 zoning district would go to city council.
Okay?
We're recommending both annexation and the zone.
Yeah.
Right.
Anything we need to know about the 7W?
Again, the description you have in your backup, the W7 district allows for the residential, tourist, visitor, and recreational uses and limited commercial uses. Kind of a mixed use, lower impact along the lake frontage. Development should address the lake and not, turn its back to the lake, for lack of better words. And keeping in mind, obviously, the sensitivity of the lake because it is our primary water source.
But it says commercial, limited commercial uses are permitted as conditional uses.
That's correct.
Okay.
So some of the uses do require a conditional use permit. If those properties came forward, they'd come through the planning and zoning
They would have to
commission
come back through here.
and city council. That's correct.
Any other comments or questions? If not, I'll entertain a motion.
I move that we approve the annexation with the 7W zoning distinction as presented with the correction of the right-of-way note on the survey.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
I have a motion and a second. All in favor, raise your right hand. Passes 5-0. Thank you. 3B, public hearing and action, annexation and zoning. Drew?
Thank you, sir. This is 884 Farm to Market Road. Excuse me, that's 783, not 784, on Harper Road. Consideration for the zoning of a, oh, excuse me, that's the wrong description. The PD, this property here, it's currently open as Ag Pro Retail Center, John Deere dealership, and they are requesting annexation. They abut the city limits on the rear of the property, backing up to the heights. And the request is primarily driven to tie into city water and sewer based on the current status of their well. We are recommending a PD zoning, as our current zoning districts don't specifically address Harper Road. Your west zoning districts talk more specifically about Junction Highway and the impact that would have. Your northern districts talk about the impacts on Sidney Baker, Highway 16, and the intersection along I-10 and Highway 16. Recommending PD so that these businesses don't come in as grandfathered use from day one. They're listed uses as permitted before you are similar to the W1 district, which does reference Junction Highway, but as far as comparable type uses on a gateway into the city. And staff's recommending that, again, this PD with this list of permitted uses and annexation, and I'd be pleased to answer any questions now or after public hearing.
And so a John Deere dealership falls under that?
Yes.
Okay, this calls for a public hearing. I'll open the public hearing at 4:59. Anyone wishing to speak to the commission, approach the lectern. Give us your name and address, please. Hearing none, seeing none, I close the public hearing at 5 o'clock. Comments?
Drew, can we talk about the PD aspect of it? Is there another way, another path? I know we're gonna be doing a zoning code update soon.
Correct. The other option you would have under the zoning descriptions, the Gateway District does reference in its purpose statement future gateways into the city, which Harper Road obviously is a gateway into the city from I-10 and areas north of town. The issue I would have with that is this business would come in still with a gateway zoning, but then it's still grandfathered because that would not be allowed by right in the gateway zoning district. So then it's a justification. Do we want to annex them as is, knowing that they are grandfathered use from day one and cannot change without a zone case at that time? Or the PD district, as kind of designed here, brings them in as a conforming use so that they do meet the code and can make changes to the business as needed as they continue to grow. That answer your question?
Yes, I know that we've had discussions about not wanting a bunch of little PDs all over town.
Correct.
So I just bring that up.
I just felt with the west districts, which is Harper Road based on the 1997 zoning, Harper Road would be on the west side of town, the west category. Those districts specifically address the areas in which they're designated, W1 being the far west side of Junction Highway, Some of the, W3 and 4 talking about Goat Creek and Diedert Creek as they come in towards the river. The general consensus of those districts talk so specifically about the area that they were originally designed for wasn't quite fitting to this area. So this gives you a similar list of uses, but doesn't kind of confuse the issue with tying it to other geographic locations.
So this area needs to be looked at
It
during
does.
the update. With the PD, it's carries on forever, correct? Is that,
Right, it'd be the same as any other zoning change, carry through future landowners, future businesses until there was a change that came before the commission.
So, these permitted land uses fall under the specific PD right now. If other properties are annexed or a new zoning distinction comes for that area, this property would still fall under its PD.
Unless a future zone case, for example, if we do an overhaul of the zoning code and there is a recommendation to update the zoning maps, then a new zoning could be put in place. Otherwise, this would control. That's correct.
Okay.
And again, the other alternative, the commission could just recommend some other default zoning, either the gateway, R1, something more restrictive than this PD. They would come in as grandfathered, and then as the area continues to develop and is studied in more detail, possibly with a new zoning district specific to this area, they could be addressed at that time.
So what you're saying, if we recommend a change to gateway zoning, how would that affect this application?
It would move forward to city council still for the annexation and gateway zoning. And the applicant would just know that the day they open, well, I guess they're already open, but the day they become a city property, they're already grandfathered in. Any amendments to their business or structures would have to require approval by the zoning board of adjustment.
So either way, it doesn't affect the business at all.
Right, they could still continue operating.
Might just affect the future.
Yeah, the future
Expansion.
development, expansion, et cetera.
and the next agenda item is another PD right next to this one?
That's correct. Recommending the same list of uses. It's the property, let's just switch to the next map. Just to the south. That property there. These were both under a joint water well agreement. Through one reason or another, the well was plugged, and to re-drill a well was cost prohibitive at this point, so both properties seeking annexation.
So they can tie into our infrastructure.
Right. Both properties did negotiate in the past with the city when the water line was extended up Harper Road. So there is a existing water and sewer line on their property through an easement and those negotiations. So they're just looking to tie onto those existing water lines and water taps.
Any more comments, questions?
You know, if we want to make that happen, I guess do you think Gateway, if we went that direction, would be the most appropriate zoning?
It would certainly be more restrictive until it had a more in-depth study of what the future of Harper Road should be. We are looking at just two properties on a long stretch of gateway or roadway into the city. That would certainly be more in line with Sidney Baker is also zoned gateway. So that would be.
Well, we don't want to encumber either business, but it seems to me if you zoned them, and then during that zoning code update, then now you have some flexibility to make that area work better.
That's
than
true.
having two planned development districts right in the middle of it.
That's absolutely true.
Well, I think it makes it more favorable towards the comprehensive plan as well.
right.
Okay. And staff supports that change as well.
It just gives us more flexibility
Right.
down the road than a PD would.
Correct.
Any questions in that regard?
Sounds better.
So you're suggesting Gateway instead of PD?
I'm open for Motion?
I'll make a motion that we annex this property with a initial zoning of gateway.
Versus the PD. Okay.
Versus yeah, right.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
I have a motion and a second. All in favor, raise your right hand. Passes 5-0. Thank you. 3C is again, public hearing and action, annexation and zoning. True?
Thank you. This is the property next door at 874, Farm Market 783. Again, this is the same list of uses for PD. Staff would support the change to gateway as well. Be pleased to answer any questions.
What's on that property now? Strip center?
Yes, it's a
Basement?
small strip center. I believe it's mostly office type uses, but they'd be set up for some retail as well.
The property behind it, what is it? Is it
It's-
city or?
No, it's county. It is a different owner. It's a mini warehouse property.
Okay.
And it would stay county.
It would stay county, that's correct.
Do they have an easement across this property? Is that what that looks like?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, this calls for a public hearing. I'll open the public hearing at 5:08. Anyone wishing to address this commission, step up to the lectern and give us your name and address, please. Hearing none, seeing none, I close the public hearing at 5:08 plus. Is this going to have kind of the same circumstance we just talked about?
Same issues. I'll make a motion, we annex this piece of property with an initial zoning of gateway and not the land development district.
Okay, I have a motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second that.
And I have a second. All in favor, raise your right hand. Motion passes 5-0. Thank you. Yeah, we move to 4, consideration and action. Consideration and final action, alternative screening.
Thank you, Chairman. This is at 1010 Sidney Baker. The building is being remodeled to be a car wash. Existing building, existing development. As you can see in this photo, along the back of the property, there's, let's say, anywhere from 6 to 10 foot retaining wall, 6 foot chain link fence on top of that, and obviously some mature landscaping. The current zoning behind this property for Mountain View Cemetery is R1, and our code with this new permit for the remodel, our code requires a screening fence be installed on the property line between the commercial property and the single family zoned property, although it is, as I said, occupied as a cemetery. The request is before you to accept the existing retaining wall, chain link fence, and landscaping as an alternative screening. Argument being that an 8-foot fence for that 40 or 50 feet of the property line doesn't really serve any benefit to the area, to the community, or to the public. Mr. and Mrs. Renfro are here if you have any questions for them. Staff supports the request. I'd be pleased to answer any questions.
Would y'all like to make any comments?
He said everything. We're 100% behind what he says.
Okay.
Drew, is it true that cemeteries are actually not in the city limits? Is that correct, or it is part of the city limits?
As far as I know, this one is.
This one is?
You said it's
Some of them
$70.
are, and some of them are?
I believe so.
Okay.
Does the cemetery run the entire length of the rear of this property?
For the most part, there is an adjacent property that's really back behind the building you can't see. There's existing residence, but it's the same zoning as the commercial property, so a screening fence is not required in that location.
Okay.
I apologize, I didn't put a zoning map in here to show that.
And I did talk to, Mr. Garza, he's the caretaker, and he said that the privacy fence wouldn't be necessary.
Okay.
This is the property that's under construction,
Yes,
Yes.
isn't it?
that's correct.
His picture's kind of dated back to the, after the hail.
It is. That's when it was occupied by a dent repair place. This is from the Google Street View, but it has, still had a good shot of the mature landscaping through the summer, so,
Okay, thank you.
thank you.
Any comments? Questions?
I mean,
I think this-
normally with an R1 designation, I would say that, you know, that retaining wall and that chain link fence doesn't constitute appropriate screening. But with the cemetery being on the other side, it's not gonna be anything else but a cemetery from now on. You know, I think that screening requirement could be lessened.
I'll take a motion in that regard. If you're ready.
I move that we approve the alternative screening as presented.
Do I have a second?
I'll second.
I have a motion and a second. All in favor, raise your right hand. Yeah. Passes 5-0. Thank you. Okay, the last agenda item we have today is 4B. In regard to the property we discussed earlier in the agenda.
That's correct. This is the preliminary plat labeled as the landing for the 59 acres for proposed annexation with W7. Just to give your bearings here. This is the corner of James Road and Thompson Drive. So Thompson Drive is on the bottom of the page. The river, obviously at the top. Knapp Road runs along right about here. It is labeled as to be abandoned, again, through that separate process with city council. They are proposing, they do have some designations on this preliminary plat already showing the residential versus commercial property. See if I can get the mouse to cooperate. This property, and this property being residential, the balance being commercial proposal. And then you can see the street system. This one here is actually a drainage system that would run through the property. At this time, they are talking through with the city to possibly dedicate a portion of this as a park with access to the river and James Road. There's an access point that runs from James Road back to this drive, allowing access to the park and a drive around. This proposed Street A does show a hammerhead dead end here for adequate turnaround and access to the adjacent properties. Staff supports the preliminary plat. I know you have some citizens that would like to make some comments as well, but I'd be pleased to answer any questions now or after.
Is the residential, is it multifamily or single family?
Some of it will be residential and some will be townhouses.
The portion adjacent to the river, you said that was going to be abandoned? Would that fall under city?
For Knapp Road, yeah,
Yes,
they're
from
proposing
that area towards the river.
correct. James Road would stay as it is down to the river. Just this portion of Knapp Road within their property would be proposed for abandonment.
So, but the section that's proposed for park is just that one little piece up in the corner.
That's correct. This piece here is park, and this would be a private green space.
Okay.
Did I hear that two-story limitation was agreed to or asked for?
Do you want to speak to that? Sorry.
Steve, I thought I heard earlier that there was some discussion about a two-story limitation. Was that an agreement or just talk?
I I have not heard that discussion. I was
Okay.
not a participant with that.
Okay, I just heard it came up earlier
I
today.
think that our plans are being consistent with our current plans, but I haven't heard anybody putting any kind of limitations on that. But that would be a discussion we'd have with the city.
Okay, I don't think the city has a limitation anymore, did it? It used to be 3 stories, I think.
So I believe so off the top of my head, that's right.
Okay, this is not a public hearing, but some of y'all had comments earlier, Mr. Johnson.
What's gonna be their access at the end of the day?
The neighbors? Well,
They're gonna come,
they can
they're
either-
offering to come through here.
Right, so you could come through
Okay,
here.
drainage and stuff is going to be addressed by the engineer.
They got a 24-foot private drive. which they
There's a
got
lot of very
maybe
strict
12 feet.
codes involved with that.
Well, they,
have to be
so it sounds like the
lined up
developers
before
offered
they
to
can
expand
get
that acreage to them. They haven't come to an agreement yet. There's other
Well,
stickers.
because of the.
Right, but technically, I mean, it could be a problem.
Then we'll talk
Maybe,
to-
I can't, so there, then his response is.
So this,
well, it's
so,
blue lines.
so
I
this
think
guy,
we
his
just have
only
to
access legally
make a
is this
decision
way.
whether we can do
Because he doesn't,
Okay,
no,
guys.
no, no, he doesn't have
Yes, sir.
human access.
I don't know that the developer is really
So that's-
happy with it, but y'all have a piece of paper that looks like this.
Right, so that's it.
And what I was suggesting to Mr. McDonald and his organization, there's a parallel blue line right there. At the time that we originally saw this, it was assumed that the area that is from the commercial, edge of the commercial lots down to the river would be park area. And there was a sidewalk through it and so on that kind of dovetails with the walkways through the river bottom that we have and enjoy here in the middle of town. By turning that into a width of concrete, similar to what is going on with this walkway that's down here in this river, and a retaining wall up against those structures, up against these commercial structures, then it would take care of the issue of any of these structures being in the floodplain, which is going to have to be addressed. And I'm not sure that this line that's in here now is the 2016, 2017 floodplain, because has changed, because it has been updated. But by allowing that to be at least a vehicle wide, that allows for that Knapp Road that's going to be abandoned to use that strip for ingress and egress to Mr. Biltz's country back here. It helps maintain the construction that goes on top of it and allows the ingress, allows them to get rid of the county road, and allows all that river or all that vehicle flow and so on and people to access this park area. I was unaware that there was only one section over here in the corner that was going to be parkland. The red area down the middle is for pondage and retainage. Somewhere on this structure, somewhere on this guy here, there has got to be pondage and retainage. In my history in this community, I have been bit by pondage and retainage many times. And it's going to have to occur somewhere on this property, and it's expensive to do. It appears to me that using that swale through there and using some type of impoundment controls that water runoff, saves them a bunch of money, and moves this project through. And I think that pretty much cuts the end of it, because the 100-year floodplain is going to have to be addressed in this guy. And it needs to be on that plat as to how it's going to be addressed, if nothing else, down the side of here. Otherwise, we end up having to deal with it at some future date. And have you ever seen any construction go down in cost in a future date? And either the city or the developer is going to have to pony up to be able to handle that. And primarily, It allows for the control of stormwater runoff from the density of construction here in such a way as that we don't poison our river and we don't poison the ASR system where we take that water and quasi-process it and shove it in the ground. It's no longer a secondary water treatment unit. It is a primary. You take the water, you clarify it a little bit, shoot the chlorine to it, put it in the ground. Well, we're just down the street and around the corner from this, from where the ASR is, and you can tell when the water's being shocked because it shows up on the silverware. It tells you. So, anyway, I appreciate your time again.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. McDonald, do you have a comment?
Well, I'll be glad to comment at the end of all of it, but while I appreciate what Mr. Johnson's saying, the problem with what he's saying is, number one, we have addressed the floodplain. That's why those lots are pulled back. That's why we have the green space. Number two, what he's proposing is a wall there, which would be built in the floodway, which would require, I don't know how much Corps of Engineers permits to get built. Number two, and then it would just be obtrusively ugly from the other side of the river and from our property, because what we want to maintain is the slope down to the river so that it looks natural, and so people who live in our area can walk down to the river. And we have not only the cost of building a retaining wall, but it's just going to be very unattractive. And I think I appreciate the idea, but I just don't think it gets us from where we need to be to where we need to go, because it's just not feasible with what we'd have to do in the floodplain and in the floodway. Big difference.
Okay, thank you. Any construction that's going to be done here anyways going to be subject to some pretty strong scrutiny by engineers. So, to look at those things. Mr. Johnson, thank you. Let's see, Bill, did you have make some comments?
I'll share.
Here's an
Oh, we got to share. Okay, there we go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Bill Matthews, 1265 Thompson Drive, outside of Kerrville, but in the ETJ, directly across from the proposed McDonald development on Thompson Drive. I'm 75 years old. My parents moved back to Kerrville in 1945. I was reared in Kerrville, graduated from Tivy, and have always appreciated Kerrville and its environments as one of the best places in the country to live and raise a family, which is why I moved back to Kerrville over 40 years ago. During the many years I have lived here, I've watched Kerrville change and grow. While I have not always favored all the changes, I understand the practicality of what has taken place. If I had my druthers, I would prefer to watch from our front porch the cattle grazing on Mrs. James' property across Thompson Drive from our house. I understand the desire of of the McDonald Company to develop the property as a business venture, and I am inherently not opposed to the development. My interest is that the project would represent the very best and highest standards for such a premier location, taking into consideration the health, safety, and general welfare of the citizens of Kerrville and surrounding environment. Therein encompasses my concern that the Planning and Zoning Committee approve an effective method to contain and/or eliminate potential pollutants and toxins from the impervious surfaces of the development from contaminating Lake Nimitz, which is Kerrville's primary source of drinking water and the source of injection water into the aquifer. The preliminary plat drinking of the landing dated June 11, 2018 that I received from the city of Kerrville about a week ago does not reflect how this issue will be addressed to comply with current regulatory rules and standards. My wife, Tricia, and my other areas of interest and concern are light pollution, mitigated with down lighting and minimal luminosity fixtures, traffic congestion due to increased population concentration and development density, mitigated with proper traffic control arrangements and standards. 3, type of commercial development having an impact on noise and pollution generation, mitigated with zoning and land use restrictions commensurate with prime residential areas. And 4, increased trash and waste along the thoroughfare easement. Thank you for your comments and considerations in this matter.
Thank you, sir. Any questions that y'all have to speak? Comments, questions? Oh, yes, sir.
Since we're having history lessons here on people, my parents came to Kerrville in 1937. I grew up here, and we lived in a house. My daddy wired most of the houses in Kerrville after the war, and he was an electrical contractor here for many, many years. I grew up in the house right across from the Presbyterian Church there. We moved in there in '49. I flew in the Air Force. I came back. I was editor of the daily paper for Bill Dozier. And then my primary occupation, I worked for the state I had private work for 10 or 12 years, and I worked for the state for 10 or 12 years. So then we came back to Kerrville, and we bought Dr. Knapp's old house out here. Primary reason was because of the location and area around it. I know that we didn't buy this 30 acres over there, and they're entitled to do what they want to with their property as long as it meets the standards that are required by the city and the law. The one big problem I have is the road. That's my only legal access. They want to divert me. I don't know what they want me to do. Go through their subdivision some way, I don't know, which is, of course, a very different approach. We have a gate to our property. It's Mr. Johnson put it in, and it's our gate together. It's a security gate that's been there for a long time, and it borders on the end of Knapp Road. Now, this plat shows Knapp Road over there on the west side, and that is not Knapp Road at all, never has been. And that needs to be removed from that plat before it's approved, the name Knapp Road. On the abandonment of the access road, that is a different matter, and I want to make it clear that any notation on this plat does not confer an abandonment of that road or entitle them to start tearing it up or working on it or doing anything on it. Because it's a public road and it has to go through the statutory process of discontinuation by the county or the city or both or whatever the statutes allow. My main point is the water. This plat does nothing for the protection of the drinking water of the city of Kerrville. That lake out there has been protected ever since it was built. There's not a single thing on that lake now that runs water off of development, off of concretes, off of streets into that lake. Not one thing on it. Our property, we've protected it. We got lakefront there. We've protected it. It has native, some fairly rare native grasses. And any runoff there is filtered through the grasses and the stuff that we do not run water in the river, and I don't think anybody around runs water in that river. And there's nothing in here that protects it at all. Mr. Johnson and Mr. Matthews both addressed the water issue to some extent, but the plat requirements of the city of Kerrville have not been met at all, and I'll point out some of the deficiencies. there's no water course or drainage features shown, and that is a requirement listed on the thing. The floodplain is not correct. There's no showing how it'll run water on my property or adjacent property, and that is a requirement of the preliminary documents or subdivision. There is no density at all shown in any of the documents filed. And the density out there is tremendously important, because if they put in apartments, they've got all these paved streets, they've got paved parking lots, they've got half the ground covered perhaps. And the way I read that plat, it has one drainage area down the middle. Now, I don't know if y'all are familiar with that land out there, but it's a hillside. And when it rains, there's a lot of water down there. Matter of fact, on our private road, almost every time it rains, Mr. Johnson gets out his bobcat and we keep the road maintained. There's that much water running off of those hillsides and into that river. The city of Kerrville already has drinking water violations by the state. It's paid $279,000 just for a study of how to cure some of these problems. The main problem with that drinking water is excessive organic matter in the water. And that organic matter is a problem on this project, particularly when you go tearing out the road and doing all the other stuff down by the river. And it's also lets all the oil, gas, all the sludge out of the streets, everything. If you look at that plat, they run right down toward the river. And it's going to drain all of that stuff off of this 59 acres into the drinking water of the city of Kerrville. There's no deflection burns. There's nothing that protects the water going into the river, and that is a requirement of a plat stated on the rules of the city. As for density, another requirement of a plat is it shows lots and stuff on a subdivision. Here they show lots as 6 and 7 acre lots. Now, are those going to be maintained as one lot?
Yes.
Well, 6 or 7 acre lots, I don't know what all they're going to try to put on one, but you know that they're going to try to break it up and put a lot of stuff in that 6 or 7 acres. And my understanding is that they want to provide housing out there for as much as 300 units. Well, 300 units is probably 12 to 1,500 people. And this flows straight down into the river. The preliminary, back to the road, the labeling on it needs to be corrected. I guess they told their engineer to label our private road over there as Knapp Road. The notice is for the annexation and everything else says it goes from James Road to Knapp Road on the west. Well, Knapp Road is on the north. It's not even on the west. The abandonment of that road is almost an impossibility under the statutes of the state of Texas and the Texas Supreme Court case, which I've provided to the city attorney and to the county attorney, that if one abutting property owner objects and it's their only access, it cannot be abandoned. And we do not think that road ought to be abandoned. It's been there for 75, 85, 90 years. I don't know how long. When we were kids, we went across there in our car to that low water bridge, and we went out there. You could go as far as Dr. Knapp's house. That's where it was. And also, if a road is abandoned, the courts say that the diminution in value of adjoining property or abutting properties must be paid. So there's no question we're a abutting property owner. Our gate is the end of that road, and it abuts it for the distance across it. I think there are all of these inadequacies in this plat, and I don't think it should be approved until this water situation is addressed where it'll protect the drinking water of the city of Kerrville. And I think this plat ought to be tabled, and it ought to be sent back for them to correct these deficiencies and get this water protection stuff particularly taken care of. One drainage down the middle of this thing is going to be an absolute catastrophe because it's draining all of that land from Thompson Road to the river, down a drainage thing, and they show culverts under these streets they're proposing. You know what happens to a culvert when you get a flood of water, and if y'all have been around here long enough, you've seen that Guadalupe River. It's flooded this road. Knapp Road has been flooded on a lot of occasions. Upper Guadalupe River Authority got a flood easement. They got a flood easement on this land. They got a flood easement on my land. In '92, I believe it was, I was told, that road was underwater for 3 days. And
Mr. Bilton, I
yes.
asked you to kind of wind it up. This is not a public hearing.
I'm winding up, and as I was trying to wind up saying this plat ought to be tabled and sent back for the consideration of these water things particularly, and not adopted at this time.
Thank you. Drew, let me ask you, would you address the difference between a preliminary plat and final plat? Oh.
That's a good question.
That's a good
We'll wait for that to
Yeah.
respond.
The preliminary plat is their concept plan, gives them direction from the commission and city staff to move forward with their final civil engineering design, street design, water and sewer design, drainage, stormwater. They do show their proposed improvements on this property. As that moves forward into final design, then those final designs will be approved by the city engineer. Once those are either installed according to the civil engineer plans, approved by the city engineer, or have some kind of payment in lieu of, whether it's a bond or cash in lieu, then that final plat would come before the commission for review. But this gives them their direction that this meets the intent of the ordinances and the commission before they finalize all of that engineering and architectural design.
Okay.
So Mr. Bilton's concerns would be addressed on a final plat, not on a preliminary plat.
Both. They are addressed on this plat. They do show some existing improvements, and they do show some future improvements.
But not a full.
But not a full-blown engineering
civil
study.
engineering, yeah.
That's correct.
Mr. McDonald?
Thank you for clarifying that, Drew. You took some of the words out of my mouth.
Justin, state your name and address.
My name's Justin McDonald, 2956 Dry Hollow Drive. I guess if we have to start out by listing our Kerr County resume, I'll say that my great-great-great-great-grandfather came to this county before it was even a county. It was still part of Bear County. My great-great-great-grandfather was the first Kerr County clerk. Long line of Tybee graduates in our family, including myself. I've grown up here. I have a family here and plan to stay here till I'm in the ground here. So, with that being said, I have a great deal of respect for this community as well and for this river. I've grown up around it. I've seen it come up. I've seen it go down. I've seen it go almost dry. So we are absolutely taking aesthetic concerns and environmental concerns into play as we're moving forward in the design of this. As Drew mentioned, it's not really appropriate to show those items on a preliminary plat. Drainage is not done yet. We do have an engineer. We've got Matkin Hoover Engineering, who does a lot of work in the city of Kerrville. They are working on that. We have Peter Lewis Architects that are working on the concept plan with Matkin Hoover in order to ensure that there's something that looks good, that functions well, and that is appealing to the community and to the people that will be living and working in this area. So, Mr. Bilta mentioned some issues with the environmental water quality. And I do want to address that because right now there's a road basically right on the banks of the river. Part of what we're talking about would be to abandon that road and to move it up out of the floodway, off of the river, and actually have green space between any roads, any vehicular traffic, and the river itself, which I think, as he mentioned, those natural grasses and open space tends to do a pretty good job of filtering that out. As for master detention, we're actually not doing master detention on this project. We're going to do it on each individual lot. So again, as we go forward with our engineering, Mr. Kolachny and his engineering firm, we're going to be sizing those and taking care of that. This is not one giant alleyway down the middle of the property that's going to be a water highway, if you will. That's actually meant to be kind of a meandering dry creek, which will also help filter stormwater out as it goes down there in a green space to allow pedestrian access to get down to the river park as well. So I think, again, this is a preliminary plat, preliminary being the key word here. And so I just ask you to approve it. It complies with the Kerrville subdivision ordinance. And so that's, as you know from your training, a ministerial action on the part of this commission. So I appreciate your consideration. Be happy to answer any questions.
Justin, can you speak to the access points for the properties?
Sure. Well, as has been mentioned several times, there is a private road that currently runs down from Thompson Drive that services actually all of those properties. We have offered to trade our piece of that to the property owners in exchange for their approval of this. That would be one means of access. The other means of access would be, let me see if I can figure this mouse out. There we go. If you go down, so currently they travel down James Road to this corner. Sorry, I'm not really good with the mouse. And then down Knapp Road to about right here, and then it enters that private driveway. All we are talking about doing would be essentially moving up here and traveling down this proposed street down to this Hammerhead T, which would then potentially have a gate or whatever means of access they want, also onto that private road. So they actually still do have two means of access, just as they do today, not one legal access, as was mentioned earlier. And again, then they also have the option of going down this street over here, this street. There's multiple options, all of which are out of the floodplain, all of which are newly built and maintained roads. Mr. Johnson's not going to have to get out there with his Bobcat after it rains every time and clean up the road anymore. So I think, ultimately this will be beneficial for everybody involved.
Okay, thank you.
Questions?
May I respond to what he said that's in error? I have no legal access to go to Thompson Drive except through Knapp Road. I have no easements, I have nothing. I would have to go through two properties of theirs and the other property up there. So I have no legal access out that way at all. And while I'm here, the requirements for a preliminary plat that's issued by the city requires water courses, drainage features, and existing draining structures to be shown on the plat.
Those are all identified on the plat, sir.
It says the project cannot be scheduled for consideration unless all this has been completed. And I pointed out about 8 deficiencies in this plat, so it should not be approved.
Drew, can you address those questions?
Again, they are preliminary. Code does require the location, size, and description of existing and proposed improvements adjacent to or for use by the subdivision, including any gas lines, petroleum lines, sanitary sewers, stormwater and water lines, water towers and wells, electrical and telecommunication lines, drainage structures, streets and alleys, and parks. They did submit preliminary water and sewer plans in addition to the plat you have before you as part of that. Again, the drainage structure they're showing through that central piece would be kind of the drainage for the master area. The retention they're looking at on a lot by lot basis.
And each one of these lots will be required to submit a development site plan.
That's correct.
And in that development site plan, it'll show the building structures, all of the required drainage and retention portions of the property in that development site plan.
That's correct.
And at the same time, as part of their construction, they're having to meet TCEQ requirements for runoff during construction and after construction.
Right.
Correct. Yeah, and just to clarify that, Mr. Harmon, we will have to ensure what are called best management practices throughout the course of construction to ensure that additional siltation and other pollutants are not washed into the river as a part of our construction. So we'll have siltation fencing up, probably some rock berms, and that sort of thing to ensure that only clean water essentially makes it to Nimitz Lake.
Back to the access issue. This gentleman doesn't have legal access, but the plat wouldn't change that either way. I don't see how the plat affects that issue. I'm trying to understand.
Right, and thank you. Need to clarify, the plat does not abandon Knapp Road. They're just proposing that as part of their layout. That would have to go to City Council for approval. They are showing a new means of access by a public road to all properties that we're using Knapp Road as their legal access. Moving that out of the floodplain, of course, for the new road. So to some extent, they're replacing the existing access with a new access point, but they're not landlocking any property with this preliminary layout.
The council would have to approve it.
And council would have to approve that. If for some reason the abandonment of Knapp Road were not approved, the preliminary plat would have to come back to the commission for approval, showing how Knapp Road is going to remain and how they're going to address that with their development project.
And so the new access point to these properties is where this hammerhead turnaround is occurring.
That's correct.
And just to be clear, because it was mentioned, I think maybe earlier at some point in the meeting, but assuming that if the city council were to approve the abandonment of Knapp Road, we would not actually take that out until after a good new street was put in, so that the residents' access would be uninterrupted. I certainly understand their concern about not wanting to drive through a construction zone.
They want to give me a new access. I have a stone gate of considerable expense. As a stone gate, I have a paved road up to my house from Knapp Road, not from some point they want to decide up here on the other end. So all of that I have as far as my entrance, my access, my paved road is wiped out, essentially non-usable.
Justin, is there any way to run a road down to that entrance, or is that not?
We'd certainly be happy to discuss it with Mr. Bilto. We've sent him a couple of letters trying to make contact, and this is the first time that we've heard from him back. So we'd be happy to sit down and talk with him as we have with some of the other neighbors.
Any other comments? If not,
thank you.
Thank you, Justin. Any comments?
One question on the requirement of detention. What are the city's requirement for detention on this piece of property?
That I'll defer to Kyle, our city engineer.
Good afternoon. Simple is that anything proposed cannot exceed what is already existing. If you have 10 CFS going into the river at this point, or any adjacent properties, then we cannot exceed existing the 10 CFS.
Ultimately, it's going to the river.
What's that?
Ultimately, the drainage is going to the river.
Correct. And so that's one of the things that the engineer is going to look at on a site-by-site basis, is that the total going to any adjacent property or the river does not exceed what's already existing there.
Thank you.
So, any other questions?
No, I know that addresses one of your questions, Mr. Bilta, on runoff to the adjacent properties. And he said there are guidelines to protect that
that doesn't address what would come down that street onto our land, I don't believe.
Well, I think it has to.
Yeah. Legally, it has to. I mean, for them to have a building permit and for them to get inspected and eventually occupy the property, all of those conditions and code requirements have to be met.
The street that abuts our property over there cannot run water onto us.
More than what it already does.
Well,
More than what the land already does.
yeah.
Okay, if there's no more questions, I'll accept a motion on 4B.
I'll make a motion, we accept the preliminary plat as presented.
I have a motion, do I have a second?
I'll second.
I have a motion and a second. All in favor, raise your right hand. All opposed? You have four for, one opposed. Mr. Jones opposes. It passes, 4-1. Number 5, staff report.
The only thing we have upcoming is council is looking at appointing a code review committee as kind of a follow-up to the comprehensive Kerrville 2050 plan. That committee will look at and start to prioritize different city codes and ordinances to review. Obviously, as we've talked before, one of those being the zoning code, one of those being the subdivision code, and whether or not to hire an outside consultant to do some of those reviews. Some other ones would be, park dedication, right-of-way ordinance. There's a handful of things for that committee to review. They'll start meeting this fall. Other than that, just moving along.
I hope it's going to be a shorter term than the silly committee.
Right. With the zoning code update, we are proposing a third-party consultant come in and kind of direct that process with their expertise. I know some of you are well aware and probably have experience as a volunteer to review the zoning code. That's quite an undertaking. Just from a staff standpoint, to stop the daily work and review that code would be quite an undertaking. And we don't have the means to do that. So we're looking at hiring a consultant to do that. Of course, that'll be reviewed by the Code Review Committee and City Council. But ultimately, that's our goal, is to take a better look at the zoning code, how that applies and fits within the comprehensive plan. As you all sat on the comprehensive plan committee, except Ms. Byram, there are some areas that still need further study with the plan on those catalyst areas. They've given a general direction, but some of that'll, making sure the zoning code fits comprehensive plan, that'll be an important piece.
Okay, thank you. Before we ask for adjournment, I do want to thank anybody that makes comments. Those comments are listened to. This wasn't, the last piece wasn't a public hearing, but we opened it up for discussion, which I think was good for not only the members of this commission, but a better understanding by everybody involved. So I want to thank you for that. If there's no other business, I'll ask for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Have a motion, have a second.
Second.
All in favor, raise your hand. We're adjourned. Thank you.